Pete's and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced their lives? In this series, we take a closer look at the lives of these Christian leaders and invite them to share their stories with us. Here with me is Dr. John Hammond, Senior Educator. Welcome, John. It's lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sounds like you had a very interesting childhood. You were the son of missionary parents. Tell us some more.
Well, it started when I was 4, and we were living in Kempsey in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And my father was a very successful young surgeon with a country practice, doing well, and responded after some time to a call to go to Jamaica as a doctor. But 2 weeks before we sailed, he got a phone call from the division saying, would you go instead to Penang in Malaya, as it then was? He said yes, and then afterwards asked why. And they said, well, the previous doctor has fled because there is a communist terrorist emergency that has just started. And every European head is worth $5,000, attached or otherwise. And there is a danger with cobras. There has been an outbreak following the breakdown of the infrastructure in the war. So with that good news, we flew.
So of course, that was a great reason to go.
Well, I think everything was packed. They just had to change the address on the big boxes. And we arrived in Penang, and the very next morning at our house at 22 Brown Road, he opened the back door in the dark and he put his foot on the back of a 3-metre king cobra, a Hammond ride. He slammed that door so fast he nearly left his foot outside, and he came in and he said to my mother, don't unpack. There's a plane going back to Australia tomorrow and the Hammond family is going to be on it. He said, I've got 3 small boys and they're going to be bitten. And he sat down, we had breakfast. He wasn't a man to spook readily, and I suppose he was thinking of the returned missionary stories he'd be able to tell after 18 hours. And he said, well, I'm going to put God to the test. He said, we'll have prayer. I'm going to take my Bible, I'm going to open it, and I'm going to open it anywhere, and I'm just going to jam my thumb inside, and if there is not a message from God under my thumb, we go home. And he did. And he opened, and under his thumb was a text he'd never read before. Luke chapter 10 and verse 19. And wait for it, Kim. Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. He said to my mother, I think we have to stay. We lived there for 12 years. He rebuilt that hospital from the ruins of the Second World War. It is a marvellous hospital today. We killed 12 cobras in the bathroom alone. He was operating once and one got underneath the kitchen table and he had to hold the operation up, come home on his motorbike, get rid of the snake, go back and finish the operation. That doesn't happen very often. And in that 12 years, with the communist terrorist emergency, at a time when they assassinated the governor, Sir Henry Gurney, and all the Europeans were being moved out of the country, he said, God is going to protect us. And you know, it was the day before we left, we got an answer. Just God opened that little window to show how he protects. There was a knock at the door. The emergency was over, and I opened the door, and there was a Chinese man. He asked if he could speak to Dr. Hammond, and I said, he's back in Australia. He left last week. He said, can I talk to your mother? I said, Lai Chipeng, come in. And he asked my mother if she could remember a patient who'd come to the hospital many years before, nearly dead with peritonitis. In the middle of the night, Dad got up and operated, saved his life, kept him in hospital, never charged him, and he spoke to him about Christ, and the man left. We didn't know he was the chief of all communist terrorists in the country. And the man held up a small piece of paper. To this day, I wish I had have taken it, because it was about A5 size, and there was a photo of us and our car and our number plate and our names and a message written in Chinese and Malay. and it said that under no circumstances, this was given to every communist camp, under no circumstances is this family ever to be touched. Oh. And ever since then, I've just had this ingrown belief with our favourite text that God has a plan for us, and nothing is going to stop that plan from being fulfilled. And to me, it is just, well, it's our favourite text.
It is.
And it's such an unusual little text in the book of Luke. And God has been so wonderful. I've had a wonderful life. God has blessed me in so many ways.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm sure that we've got more stories later. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Dr. John Hammond, Senior Administrator, Educator. Welcome back, John. We've just heard an amazing story about you living overseas and an awful lot of snakes, probably too many for my liking. You've been an educator, you've been at all levels of education, been a teacher, been a principal, and you've worked all over Australia and even overseas. Was this always what you're going to do?
There are many people alive today who would be amazed to know that I took up teaching. I was an absolute failure at school, a classic middle child, successful father, brothers did well. My younger brother finished school 2 years ahead of me. If you want to understand what true humility is, just let your younger sibling get ahead of you in school. People would say to me, how come you're so dumb and your father is a surgeon? And this is really good for building confidence.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What was the transforming moment in your education?
Well, it was early high school. I was 13, doing poorly. A very large school in the days that if you didn't learn, you got the stick until you learned something. And I had a teacher. Two teachers feature in this story, and this particular teacher's name was Prawnhead. Not his real name, by the way.
Really?
He had a horrible temper, and he could go red in 2 seconds flat. And he had an alarming problem. He had a broken finger, which never set. And when he was angry, he would go cross-eyed. He would come into the classroom of 47 boys and he would just look straight. You stand up, and there's always a quarter of the class would get up at once. And he tried to teach me maths. And his gentle technique was to take you out to the board, write a problem, give you the chalk, and then start to count to 10.
Not a little bit overwhelming at all.
Not at all.
No.
And when you get to 10, he would give you the cane, a rattan, right across the back of the legs. And if you've had it full force, you just collapse, you writhe, your mind goes blank. And from that day to this, I have had a maths phobia. I mean, I'm not ashamed of it. I've sort of worked my way through university not doing maths. And after he'd given you half a dozen strokes of the cane, he would throw you out. And then you were at the mercy of the deputy principal, and we called him Lahore, which is Hokkien Chinese for tiger. And if he caught you out, he would take you to the quadrangle in front of about 30 classes and give you 6 strokes of the cane, and then he would listen to your excuse. So on this particular occasion, I fled, and I decided that I would hide somewhere that he couldn't find me. And I went down to the school assembly hall, and I hid in the closed curtains of the stage. And there was another teacher who was playing the piano, and he was a wonderful man, and I loved him. His name was Jimmy Boyle. And he was playing the piano, and all of a sudden I realized he'd spotted me, and he signaled like that to me. He could see what I couldn't see. He could see that the tiger was coming up the back door, and he was going to catch me. And I went down to the piano. He said, just say nothing. And that for me is quite an achievement. Stand here and say nothing. And I was standing there. Next minute I saw the figure of the tiger next to me, and Jimmy Boyle was frightened of this man. He was fearsome, and he stood, he said, "Sir, John Hammond is with me today. It's okay." And the tiger went and walked away. And I stayed there for about an hour and a half. And because of his musical abilities, he'd actually been asked to submit a composition for the national anthem of the new country that was about to be given its independence. And he would play a few bars, and he'd say, "Do you like that?" If you had played Bar Bar Black Sheep, I would have said, "Yes, Mr. Boyle, I think that's beautiful." And at the end, he closed the piano, and he stood up, and he put his arm around me, and he said, "John Hammond," he said, "I think you're pretty bright, but you've never shown any evidence of it." He said, "But I want to tell you something." He said, "God has a plan for your life. I don't know what it is, and I don't think you do either." He said, "But Jesus loves you, and so do I." He walked out of my life. He's long dead now. I look forward to meeting him in the kingdom. But that moment was a crystallizing moment in my life. And it was a very short time after that I was baptized. And for many, many years, if I had to imagine what the face of Christ looked like, somehow Jimmy Boyle's picture would always get in the road.
That's right.
He's a wonderful man. And if you go to that country and listen to the national anthem, listen very carefully, because Jimmy Boyle and I won the competition. But that was a wonderful moment in my life. It was the first moment where I really felt that God had a work for me.
Oh, definitely. Oh, that is fantastic. Stay tuned. We've got more stories like that coming up. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with Dr. John Hammond, Senior Education Administrator, and we've been having a great time, haven't we, John?
Sure have.
John is a great storyteller, and I've really enjoyed some of the stories, and I think we've got a few more coming up too that'll be just as exciting. We've just to recap on what we've been talking about. We've talked about your childhood. You've been all over the place, and you've had a bit of a drama with cobras, which I don't think I would like at all. And then we've just been talking about your experience as a student and how you struggled throughout school, and then how a teacher who was probably the shining example of Jesus, who basically set an example and I think set you straight from then on.
He did, yeah. and probably the fact that he was my geography teacher was the main reason why I finished up doing a PhD in geography.
That's amazing.
But yeah.
Tell us some of your achievements over the years.
Well, I ended up doing primary teaching, and I was never going to be a primary teacher. I referred to them as primary screechers. But the day I taught my first lesson in a primary classroom, the lights just came on, and I literally rejoiced as I ran up out of the classroom, because God said, "This is the track that I have brought you to, so that you know that I want you to teach children." And I was a primary teacher for many years. I graduated, had to open a school as a graduate, and then became a demonstration secondary teacher, and then I taught in teacher training, and then went out to Fiji, where I became principal of Fulton College, and then principal of Longbourn College, and then since then, a long time now, in education administration. And I have just had the most wonderful, satisfying, rewarding career. I just love speaking to children, and a lot of my activity is involved in speaking to youth groups as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Have you got one particular story that you can share with us, just quickly, one of your probably most memorable moments as being a teacher or being an educator?
Just, I hate to confess this because it sounds as though it's a lot of time, but I've actually taken 57 weeks of prayer. And on the last day of a week of prayer, when you make an appeal for someone who has the courage to stand and to be the first of their peers to stand and say, I will follow Jesus, that is a hugely satisfying moment. It is just wonderful. You couldn't buy that sort of satisfaction in your workplace.
So you probably do another 57 more and think it was just as good.
It'll be in retirement.
Oh, that's fantastic. So do you have any other stories that you could share about?
I had an experience in the last couple of years that was very life-changing. I was visiting a school, had my wife with me, and she rarely has the opportunity to come with me in these trips. We were up at Port Macquarie, going for a walk in the morning, and wasn't really watching where I was going. My ankle rolled and I fell over. I got up, visited schools for the next 2 days, not realizing I'd broken my neck. And took a youth rally on the Sabbath up at the Avondale College. I don't know what I spoke about, but I got home and finally went to the doctor, and I went into a coma. And I was supposed to have died. I didn't breathe for 90 minutes at one stage. They told the family I had permanent brain damage. I wasn't expected to live, and finally they were having trouble waking me up from the coma. I know now that I would not be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for the power of prayer.
Do you have any other stories that you could share about?
I have many favourite characters from the Bible, but if I had to choose one, an example of patience, meekness and love, it would have to be Moses. You know, the Bible describes Moses as being the meekest man who ever lived, and the word meek is an old English word that they used to apply to a horse, that it could be trained to be predictable, and Moses was that man, even though he was a murderer.
I was about to say, wasn't he a murderer?
Yes, he was, and an unwilling leader, and yet he brought those people untrained, been in slavery for 400 years, out of Egypt, and all they could do by way of saying thanks was to grizzle. And they grizzled about the water, they grizzled about the accommodation, they grizzled about everything, and finally God brought them all to Mount Sinai, and he said, Moses, you're coming up and I'm going to talk to you. He said to the people, be good. And he went up and he was away for many weeks. And God spoke to him. And he gave him the law. And then Moses had a question that was building in his mind as the days went into weeks. And finally he said, Lord, I have a special request to ask of you. And God said, what is it? He said, I would like to see your face. And God said, Moses, if you were to see my face, you'd be dead like that. I'm too bright. And he must have noticed that Moses was a bit downcast. And then he said, look, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm going to hide you in that cleft of the rock there, and I'm going to put my hand over it, and I'm going to walk past. And when I take my hand away, you look very quickly, and I'll let you see my back. And he saw God's back just for a moment, you know, and I often say to young people at schools, when they profane God's name, do you realize the power of the name that you are invoking? Because when Moses came down from that mountain, his face was so bright that the elders all fled from his presence. He had to wear a hat with a little veil around it. He had to live in a separate tent outside the encampment. He was so bright, and it took weeks for the brightness to fade from his face just because he'd seen God's back. And he didn't see God's face in this life. He died. He erred, and he never led the people, but he was resurrected. The book of Jude tells us that. And the moment where he looked into the face of God would have been an incredible moment. All the things that he had looked forward to came to that moment. And yet God he wanted Moses to come and talk to Christ with Elijah when Christ needed that support just before his death. And we're also told that to Moses was given the privilege of opening the gates of heaven when Christ ascended to his Father after his victorious death. And what a fulfilling moment that must have been. And you know, a few years ago I was in London, and I heard on the radio one morning that the most significant human living treasure in the world was going to give a speech in Trafalgar Square. So I got on the Underground and I shot in, and here's Trafalgar Square. And if you look at there, there's a crowd of 10,000 people, and I was at the back of it. But look at them. He hasn't even appeared on stage. I have never seen such an intense crowd staring at one spot where he's going to be. And I wanted to get to the front of that crowd, and I looked at the dear old Poms, and I know how trusting they are, so I actually got my Australian driver's license and I waved it in the air, and they let me through. And here I am at the front of the crowd, and you can still see them staring. I think two of these fellows are onto my trick. And I'm in the press box right at the front, and this great man came on. You know who it was? It was Nelson Mandela. And I saw his face. And when he finished, see all these fancy cameras, and I'm in my little tiddlywink, press a button, he came off the stage, and as he walked past, he turned to me and he said, hello. I think he saw through my trick too. And I was so excited I forgot to take a picture. But you know, that just reminds me the incredible moment it's going to be when I look into the face of Christ. I can't even imagine what it would be like to see that face with love in it, knowing that he died for me, knowing that everything in my whole life is just coming to that one point. I'm looking forward to seeing the face of Christ.
Oh, that is certainly going to be a great day, isn't it?
It sure is.
Thank you so much for your time, John.
My absolute pleasure.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on My Story, His Story. I'm Kim Peets, and we hope that you join us next time.